The photographs scattered across Senator Thaddeus Ravencrest's mahogany desk told a story that could destroy 3 generations of political legacy in a single news cycle. Bank transfer receipts, offshore account statements, and meeting recordings with cartel representatives created an undeniable web of corruption stretching back 15 years. Serafina stood frozen in her father's study doorway, having entered to retrieve a book she'd forgotten. The man she'd admired her entire life sat slumped in his leather chair, his distinguished silver hair disheveled, his hands trembling as he sorted through the damning evidence. "Daddy," her voice barely carried across the room. Thaddeus looked up sharply, his bloodshot eyes widening with panic. He moved swiftly to cover the documents, but the damage was done. His daughter had seen enough. "How long have you been standing there?" His voice carried none of its usual senatorial authority. "Long enough." Serafina stepped forward, her bare feet silent on the Persian rug. "What is all this?" The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Outside, the Connecticut autumn wind rattled the windows of their Silverdale estate, but inside, the air felt suffocating. "Sit down, sweetheart." Thaddeus gestured to the chair across from his desk, the same chair where she'd sat countless times as a child, listening to his stories about changing the world through politics. Serafina remained standing. "Are you going to prison?" The directness of her question seemed to physically wound him. He aged 10 years in that moment, the weight of his choices finally visible on his face. "Not if I can help it." He pulled out a manila folder she hadn't noticed before. "But the solution requires a sacrifice I never wanted to ask of you." "What kind of sacrifice?" Thaddeus opened the folder, revealing official documents stamped with presidential seals. "Marriage. To President Darius Thornfield." The words hit Serafina like ice water. She gripped the back of the chair to steady herself. "You're joking. The cartels gave me 72 hours to produce $10 million, or they release everything to the press. Thornfield needs a wife with an impeccable reputation to salvage his administration after the recent scandals. He's offering to pay our debts and provide legal protection in exchange for a marriage contract." "A marriage contract?" The phrase tasted bitter. "Like I'm livestock. Like you're the only thing standing between our family and complete destruction." Thaddeus stood, moving around the desk toward her. "Your mother's medical bills from the cancer treatment, your brother's law school tuition, the house payments. Everything depends on this money. Without it, we lose everything, and I spend the rest of my life in federal prison." Serafina backed toward the door. "There has to be another way. I've explored every option." His voice cracked. "The president's people contacted me yesterday. They know about the investigation, about the leverage the cartels have. Thornfield sees an opportunity, a young, pure wife to rehabilitate his image, and in return, he makes our problems disappear." "Pure." The word made her stomach turn. "Did you actually tell them I'm a virgin?" Thaddeus couldn't meet her eyes. "It's what they specifically requested." The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. Serafina had spent 22 years believing her father was a hero, a man who fought for justice and American values. The reality of who he truly was crashed over her like a violent wave. "When the ceremony is scheduled for next Friday. You'll move to Goldstone Manor immediately after to begin your duties as First Lady." "My duties." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You mean my performance." "Serafina, please understand, Dash. I understand perfectly." She moved toward the door, her hand on the brass handle. "I understand that you sold me to save yourself. To save our family." She turned back to look at him one final time. The man she'd once thought was invincible now appeared small and pathetic behind his massive desk, surrounded by the evidence of his crimes. "No, Daddy. You destroyed our family the moment you decided your political ambitions were worth more than your integrity. This marriage won't save us. It will just make me complicit in your corruption. You don't have a choice." The finality in his voice confirmed what she already knew. The cartels wouldn't wait for her decision, and Thornfield's offer came with an expiration date. Her father had orchestrated a situation where her refusal would mean his death and her family's ruin. "Then I guess we'll find out what kind of man President Thornfield really is." She opened the door, and what kind of woman his new wife becomes. As she walked away from her father's study, Serafina realized that the girl who'd entered that room no longer existed. In her place stood someone who would have to navigate the treacherous waters of Washington politics while married to the most powerful man in the country, a man she'd never met, who saw her as nothing more than a strategic acquisition. The photographs on the desk had revealed more than her father's crimes. They'd shown her that sometimes salvation came at a price too high to calculate, and that love was a luxury she could no longer afford. The black SUV convoy swept through the iron gates of Goldstone Manor like a military operation. Serafina pressed her face against the bulletproof window, watching Secret Service agents position themselves across the sprawling Virginia estate. Everything about this place screamed power and isolation, from the perfectly manicured grounds to the fortress-like architecture that seemed designed to keep the world at bay. She clutched the single suitcase containing her most precious belongings. Everything else from her old life would be shipped later, assuming she survived whatever came next. The lead agent opened her door with practiced efficiency. "Ma'am, the president is waiting in the blue room." No greeting, no welcome to your new home. Just instructions delivered with military precision. Serafina followed him through corridors lined with presidential portraits, each face seeming to judge her presence as an unwelcome intrusion into their exclusive club. The Blue Room doors opened to reveal a man she'd only seen on television and magazine covers. President Darius Thornfield stood with his back to her, studying documents spread across an antique table. At 45, he possessed the kind of commanding presence that filled a room even when he wasn't speaking. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his charcoal suit tailored to emphasize his broad shoulders and lean frame. When he turned to face her, Serafina felt her breath catch. Television hadn't captured the intensity of his steel-gray eyes or the way they seemed to dissect everything they examined. This wasn't the charming politician who appeared at campaign rallies. This was a predator evaluating his newest acquisition, Miss Ravencrest. His voice carried no warmth. "You're smaller than I expected." The comment stung with its casual dismissal. "Should I apologize for my genetics, Mr. President?" Something flickered across his features, surprise, perhaps, that she'd responded with sarcasm instead of deference. He gestured toward a chair without answering her question. "Sit. We need to establish ground rules before tomorrow's ceremony." Serafina remained standing. "I wasn't aware this was a business meeting." "Everything in Washington is a business meeting." Darius moved closer, close enough that she could smell his expensive cologne and see the faint lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult decisions. "Your father owes dangerous people a significant amount of money. I'm providing a solution that benefits both our families. By purchasing a wife like she's real estate. By entering into a mutually beneficial arrangement." His tone suggested he'd rehearsed this conversation. "You gain the protection of the presidency and access to resources most people can only dream of. I gain a spouse whose reputation can help rehabilitate my administration's standing with family values voters." The clinical way he described their future together made Serafina's skin crawl. "And what happens when you decide I'm no longer useful?" For the first time since she'd entered the room, Darius seemed to actually see her instead of simply cataloging her presence. His eyes lingered on her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken despite her anger. "That depends entirely on how well you adapt to your new role." The implicit threat hung between them. Serafina understood that her survival in this arrangement depended on her ability to play whatever part he assigned her, regardless of the cost to her dignity or authenticity. "The ceremony will be small," Darius continued, moving back to his documents. "Immediate family only, with a reception for key political allies. The press will be limited to approved photographers. You'll wear the dress my staff selected and follow the script my speechwriters prepared." "Script?" "Your vows. They've been crafted to emphasize themes of unity, redemption, and American family values. Nothing spontaneous or emotional. Even her wedding vows would be political theater." Serafina felt the last remnants of her romantic dreams crumble. She'd once imagined marrying someone who loved her enough to write his own promises, someone who saw their wedding as a celebration rather than a strategic maneuver. "Any questions about tomorrow's schedule?" She had 1,000 questions, but none he seemed interested in answering honestly. "Just one. Do you actually believe this charade will work?" Darius looked up from his papers, and for a moment, his carefully constructed mask slipped. She caught a glimpse of something raw and wounded beneath the presidential facade, the expression of a man who'd been betrayed so many times that genuine emotion had become a liability he couldn't afford. It has to work, he said quietly, because the alternative destroys everything I've spent my life building. The vulnerability in his admission surprised her. She'd expected cold calculation, not this glimpse of desperation that mirrored her own situation. They were both trapped by circumstances beyond their control, forced into an arrangement neither wanted. The moment passed quickly. Darius's emotional shields snapped back into place, transforming him once again into the untouchable president who saw her as a means to an end. Margaret will show you to your quarters. The rehearsal begins at 8 tomorrow morning. Dismissed like a staff member, Serafina turned toward the door. As she reached for the handle, his voice stopped her. For what it's worth, Miss Ravencrest, I'm sorry your father put you in this position. She didn't turn around. Are you sorry enough to release me from it? The silence that followed provided her answer. President Darius Thornfield might possess enough conscience to acknowledge the injustice of their situation, but not enough courage to sacrifice his political survival for her freedom. Tomorrow, she would become the First Lady of the United States through coercion rather than choice, bound to a man who saw her as a solution to his problems rather than a partner in his life. The wedding ceremony had lasted exactly 27 minutes. Serafina knew because she'd watched the antique clock on the mantel throughout the entire charade, counting each second that transformed her from Serafina Ravencrest into the First Lady of the United States. The reception had been even more surreal. 3 hours of accepting congratulations from people who knew exactly why she was there, their smiles as artificial as the flowers decorating the East Room. Senator Mitchell had actually winked at her father while shaking Darius's hand, as if they'd all participated in some clever political joke. Now, standing in the presidential bedroom at nearly midnight, Serafina felt the weight of her new reality settling around her like a suffocating blanket. The room was larger than her childhood bedroom back in Silverdale, decorated in muted blues and grays that reflected nothing of her personality. Everything from the silk curtains to the mahogany furniture spoke of masculine authority and cold efficiency. Darius emerged from the adjoining bathroom wearing a dark blue robe, his hair damp from the shower. Without his usual armor of expensive suits and presidential formality, he looked younger, more human. The vulnerability she'd glimpsed during their first meeting seemed closer to the surface. The bed is large enough that we won't disturb each other, he said without looking at her. I typically rise at 5:30 for my morning briefings. His attempt to establish boundaries felt hollow given their current situation. They were married now, legally bound in the eyes of the law and the American people, regardless of the circumstances that had brought them together. Serafina had changed into a simple white nightgown that her mother had given her years ago for her college graduation. She'd chosen it deliberately, wanting something that belonged to her old life rather than the wardrobe his staff had selected for her new role. This doesn't feel real, she admitted, running her fingers along the silk coverlet. Darius paused in his movement toward the bed. What part? Any of it. This morning I was reading Jane Austen in my bedroom at home. Tonight I'm the First Lady, married to a man I've known for exactly 48 hours. She turned to face him. Don't you find that at all strange? I find most of my life strange lately. He moved closer, and she caught that scent of expensive soap and something uniquely masculine that belonged only to him. 6 months ago, I thought I knew who I could trust. Now I question everyone's motives, including my own. The admission surprised her. She'd expected him to maintain his emotional distance even in private, but something about the late hour and the intimacy of their shared space seemed to lower his defenses. What changed 6 months ago? Darius sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly looking exhausted. I discovered that people I'd trusted with national security were selling information to foreign governments. My own staff, people I'd known for years, had been playing both sides while I believed they were loyal Americans. The pain in his voice was unmistakable. Serafina found herself moving closer without conscious thought, drawn by his unexpected honesty. That's why you needed a wife with an unquestionable reputation. Among other reasons. His gray eyes met hers, and she saw something there that made her pulse quicken. I told myself this arrangement would be purely strategic, a political solution to multiple problems. And now, instead of answering, Darius reached up and gently brushed a strand of hair away from her face. The simple gesture sent an electric shock through her entire nervous system. His fingertips lingered against her cheek, and she saw his expression change from controlled politician to something far more dangerous. The touch was gentle, almost reverent, completely at odds with the cold calculation she'd expected from him. Serafina felt her breath catch as warmth spread from the point of contact throughout her body. She should step away, should maintain the emotional distance that would make this arrangement bearable, but she found herself leaning into his touch instead. "I wasn't prepared for you," Darius whispered, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. The confession hit her like a physical blow. She'd spent the past 2 days convincing herself that she could endure this marriage by keeping her heart safely locked away, by treating it as an elaborate performance that would eventually end. But the way he was looking at her now, the careful tenderness in his touch, threatened to destroy every protective barrier she'd constructed. Darius. His name escaped her lips like a prayer. He leaned closer, close enough that she could feel his breath against her face. "Tell me to stop." She knew she should. Logic demanded that she maintain the boundaries that would protect them both from complications that could destroy them. This marriage was supposed to be a business transaction, not the beginning of something that could consume them both. Instead, she placed her hand over his, pressing his palm more firmly against her cheek. The kiss that followed was nothing like she'd imagined it would be. She'd expected duty, obligation, perhaps even cruelty. What she received instead was a tenderness that made her entire world shift on its axis. Darius kissed her like she was precious, like she was a gift he hadn't expected to receive. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Serafina realized that everything had changed. The man she'd married out of desperation had just touched something in her soul that she'd thought was permanently buried. And from the expression on his face, she'd done the same to him. They stood there in the dim bedroom light, both understanding that they'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. What had begun as a political arrangement had just become something infinitely more complicated and dangerous. Tomorrow they would have to pretend to be the perfect presidential couple for the cameras and the press. But tonight, in the privacy of their shared bedroom, they discovered that their hearts had their own agenda, one that could either save them both or destroy everything they'd sacrificed to protect. The morning sunlight streaming through the presidential bedroom windows felt like a mockery of the darkness that had settled over Serafina's world. 3 weeks had passed since her wedding night. 3 weeks of stolen moments and careful touches that had gradually transformed her arranged marriage into something that resembled genuine affection. She'd begun to believe that perhaps love could grow from the most unlikely circumstances. That illusion shattered at precisely 6:47 a.m. when Darius's phone rang with an emergency call from his chief of staff. Serafina watched her husband's face transform as he listened to the voice on the other end. The tender expression he'd worn while kissing her goodbye moments earlier vanished, replaced by the cold mask of presidential authority she'd hoped never to see directed at her again. "Turn on the news," he said quietly, ending the call. The television mounted on the far wall flickered to life, revealing a CNN breaking news banner that made Serafina's blood turn to ice. Senator Ravencrest corruption scandal. FBI raids Silverdale estate. The footage showed federal agents carrying boxes of evidence from her childhood home while her father was led away in handcuffs. The reporter's voice cut through the morning air like a blade, detailing money laundering schemes, cartel connections, and offshore accounts that painted Thaddeus Ravencrest as one of the most corrupt politicians in recent history. "Did you know?" Darius's voice was barely controlled, each word delivered with surgical precision. Serafina couldn't tear her eyes away from the screen. "I saw some documents in his study the night before our wedding, but I didn't understand the full scope." The night before our wedding. He stood from the bed, moving away from her as if her proximity was suddenly toxic. "You knew your father was corrupt, and you said nothing. I was told I didn't have a choice about marrying you." Her voice rose with defensive anger. "What was I supposed to do? Confess that my father was a criminal and hope you'd still go through with the arrangement that was saving both our necks?" Darius turned to face her, and the accusation in his eyes cut deeper than any physical wound. "You were supposed to trust me enough to tell me the truth." "Trust." The word came out as a bitter laugh. "You married me to improve your political image. I was a strategic acquisition, remember? Since when does trust factor into business transactions?" The news coverage continued in the background, but neither of them was paying attention anymore. The fragile intimacy they'd built over the past 3 weeks was crumbling in real time, destroyed by circumstances neither of them had seen coming. "This changes everything," Darius said, his presidential training taking over. "My administration cannot survive being connected to this level of corruption. The opposition will use this to destroy everything we've worked to rebuild." Serafina felt something cold settle in her chest. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that your father's crimes have made you a political liability I can't afford." The clinical way he assessed their relationship made her feel sick. She'd allowed herself to believe that the man who touched her so gently in the darkness was the real Darius Thornfield. But apparently the calculating politician had been there all along, just waiting for an excuse to resurface. What neither of them knew was that Secretary of State Vivian Meridian was watching the same news coverage from her Georgetown townhouse, a satisfied smile playing across her perfectly sculpted features. The morning's events were unfolding exactly as she'd orchestrated them. Vivian had discovered Thaddeus Ravencrest's vulnerabilities 18 months earlier through her extensive network of intelligence contacts. Rather than expose him immediately, she'd seen an opportunity to use his desperation for her own advancement. She'd been the one to suggest the marriage arrangement to Darius, positioning herself as the loyal advisor helping him navigate a difficult situation. The timing of the FBI raid wasn't coincidental. Vivian had spent weeks carefully feeding information to federal investigators, ensuring that the evidence would be discovered just as Darius was beginning to develop genuine feelings for his new wife. She understood his psychology better than anyone, his tendency to retreat behind emotional walls when he felt betrayed, his inability to separate personal relationships from political calculations. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her inside source at the FBI. "Package delivered as requested. Target in custody." Vivian had cultivated relationships with ambitious federal agents who were eager to advance their careers by taking down high-profile corruption cases. They had no idea they were being manipulated by someone who had her own reasons for wanting Thaddeus Ravencrest destroyed and his daughter's marriage undermined. Back in the presidential bedroom, the argument between Darius and Serafina had escalated into something that felt irreparable. "So what happens now?" Serafina asked, wrapping her robe more tightly around herself as if it could protect her from what was coming. "Now you play the role of the shocked and betrayed daughter. You publicly distance yourself from your father's crimes and hope the American people believe your innocence." And privately, Darius's silence stretched long enough to answer her question. The man who had kissed her with such tenderness just hours earlier was retreating behind the impenetrable walls of presidential protocol, treating her like a problem to be managed rather than a wife to be protected. "I see." Serafina moved toward the closet, her movements mechanical. "I should probably pack my things." "That won't be necessary. Leaving now would only fuel speculation about the state of our marriage. You'll continue your duties as First Lady while we assess the long-term implications of this situation." His ability to compartmentalize their relationship so completely was devastating. Serafina realized that while she'd been falling in love with him, he'd been maintaining enough emotional distance to cut her loose the moment she became inconvenient. Of course, can't have the public thinking the president's marriage is as fake as everything else in Washington. Darius's jaw tightened at her barb, but he didn't respond. Instead, he moved toward his private bathroom, effectively ending their conversation. As the bathroom door closed behind him, Serafina sank onto the edge of the bed, her hands shaking as the full implications of her new reality settled over her. Her father's arrest meant the end of any hope she'd harbored about eventually returning to her old life. More devastating was the realization that Darius's feelings for her had been even more fragile than she'd imagined. The television continued its relentless coverage of the scandal, with political commentators already speculating about how Senator Ravencrest's corruption would impact the president's marriage and administration. Some were calling for congressional investigations into whether the White House had prior knowledge of the criminal activity. Serafina understood now that she'd been naive to believe love could overcome the political machinations that ruled their world. In Washington, personal relationships were always secondary to survival, and Darius Thornfield was nothing if not a survivor. What she didn't know was that across town, Vivian Meridian was already planning her next move, one that would drive an even deeper wedge between the presidential couple and position herself as the only person Darius could truly trust. The destruction of his marriage was just the first step in a much larger plan that would ultimately place her in the Oval Office. The game of power had only just begun, and Serafina had no idea she was playing against an opponent who had been manipulating the pieces long before she'd ever entered the board. The drive to Maine took 14 hours, but Serafina barely noticed the miles passing beneath her rental car's wheels. She'd slipped away from Goldstone Manor at dawn, leaving behind only a brief note explaining her need for space to process her father's arrest and the media circus that had consumed their lives for the past week. What she couldn't write in that note was how Darius's coldness had become unbearable. Since the morning of her father's arrest, he'd treated her with the distant politeness reserved for foreign dignitaries, cordial but completely impersonal. The man who had kissed her with such passion just weeks earlier now barely made eye contact during their mandatory public appearances. Ironcliff Point had been in the Ravencrest family for 3 generations, a weathered Victorian mansion perched on the rocky Maine coast that her grandfather Zachariah had purchased as a summer retreat in the 1970s. The property had been abandoned for nearly 5 years since her grandmother's death, but something about its isolation called to Serafina now. She needed distance from Washington's suffocating politics and time to figure out how to survive a marriage that had transformed from unexpected tenderness into calculated endurance. The house greeted her with the musty smell of disuse and the sound of ocean waves crashing against the cliffs below. Dust covers shrouded the furniture like ghosts, and cobwebs decorated the corners where her grandmother's antique lamps had once cast warm light during family gatherings. Serafina made her way to her grandfather's study, a masculine retreat filled with leather-bound books and maritime artifacts that had always fascinated her as a child. Zachariah Ravencrest had been a different kind of politician than his son, principled, honest, genuinely committed to public service. She'd often wondered how his integrity had skipped a generation so completely. As she moved through the room, memories of summer visits flooded back. Her grandfather telling stories about his early days in the Senate, teaching her to play chess while explaining the importance of thinking several moves ahead, warning her that Washington was a city where appearance and reality rarely aligned. It was while searching for a photo album that Serafina discovered the hidden compartment behind his massive oak desk. The panel slid away easily, as if it had been designed to be found by someone who knew to look for it. Inside, she found a collection of audio recordings, each cassette tape labeled with dates spanning nearly 2 decades. Her hands trembled as she inserted the first tape into her grandfather's ancient recording system. Zachariah's voice filled the room, strong and clear despite the years that had passed since his death. If someone is listening to this, it means the situation has become more dangerous than I anticipated. What I'm about to reveal concerns a conspiracy that reaches into the highest levels of government, orchestrated by individuals who view public service as a pathway to personal power rather than an opportunity to serve the American people. Serafina sank into her grandfather's leather chair, her heart pounding as his words continued. I first became aware of Vivian Meridian's activities in 1998 when she was still a junior State Department official. She possessed an unusual talent for cultivating relationships with powerful men, gathering information about their vulnerabilities, and using that knowledge to advance her own career. What began as typical Washington networking soon revealed itself as something far more sinister. The tape continued with Zachariah's methodical documentation of Vivian's rise through the political ranks. He'd tracked her romantic relationships with key senators, her presence at classified briefings she shouldn't have attended, and her ability to position herself as indispensable to every administration she served. Vivian operates through proxies and intermediaries, making it nearly impossible to trace her involvement in the schemes she orchestrates. She identifies vulnerable politicians, those with gambling debts, extramarital affairs, or financial irregularities, and offers them solutions that come with strings attached. Over time, these individuals become completely dependent on her protection, creating a network of compromised officials who do her bidding without question. Serafina's blood turned cold as she realized her father had likely been one of these targets. The tape continued with more devastating revelations. I believe Vivian has been selling classified information to foreign intelligence services for over a decade. using her network of compromised officials to access materials far above her clearance level. She's particularly focused on defense contracts and international trade agreements that benefit specific corporations in which she holds substantial hidden interests. The next recording was dated just months before Zachariah's death. His voice sounded weaker, more urgent. Vivian has set her sights on the presidency itself. She's cultivating relationships with candidates from both parties, positioning herself to become Secretary of State regardless of who wins. From that position, she'll have access to intelligence networks that could make her the most powerful person in Washington, more influential than the president himself. Serafina's hands shook as she realized the implications. Vivian hadn't just manipulated her father's corruption scandal. She'd likely orchestrated his involvement in illegal activities from the beginning, creating the leverage necessary to force Serafina's marriage to Darius. The final tape contained the most shocking revelation of all. I've recently learned that President Thornfield is not the corrupt politician he appears to be. For the past 3 years, he's been working undercover with a joint DA-CIA task force to infiltrate Mexican drug cartels that have been corrupting American officials. His apparent moral compromises are actually carefully constructed cover stories designed to make him appear accessible to criminal organizations. The man the media portrays as ethically questionable is actually one of the most dedicated public servants I've ever encountered. The room spun around Serafina as the full scope of her situation became clear. Darius hadn't been the cold, calculating politician she'd married. He'd been an undercover operative risking everything to protect American interests. His emotional distance since her father's arrest wasn't cruelty. It was the practiced compartmentalization of someone trained to survive in hostile territory. More devastating was the realization that Vivian had used Serafina as an unwitting weapon against him. By forcing their marriage and then orchestrating the scandal that followed, she'd created exactly the kind of personal complications that could compromise an undercover operation. Serafina spent the next several hours listening to every recording, building a comprehensive picture of Vivian's decades-long campaign to accumulate power through manipulation and blackmail. Her grandfather had documented names, dates, financial transactions, and recorded conversations that painted an undeniable portrait of treason at the highest levels of government. As night fell over Ironcliff Point, Serafina sat in her grandfather's study, surrounded by evidence that could bring down one of the most dangerous people in Washington. But she also understood that exposing Vivian would require revealing Darius's undercover work, potentially destroying years of careful investigation and putting countless lives at risk. The sound of gravel crunching in the driveway interrupted her thoughts. Through the window, she saw the unmistakable silhouette of Secret Service vehicles approaching the house. Her heart raced as she quickly gathered the most damning recordings and hid them in her purse. Minutes later, Darius stood in the doorway of the study, his expression unreadable in the dim light. He'd driven 14 hours to find her, abandoning whatever presidential duties demanded his attention to follow her to this remote corner of Maine. "You shouldn't have come here alone," he said quietly. "I needed space to think." "And what conclusions did you reach?" Serafina studied his face, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time since their wedding. The man she'd thought was coldly calculating was actually someone who'd spent years sacrificing his reputation and personal relationships to serve his country. The distance she'd interpreted as rejection was the professional detachment of someone trained to protect national security at any cost. "I reached the conclusion that nothing in Washington is what it appears to be," she said carefully, "including my husband." Something flickered in Darius's eyes, surprise, perhaps, or recognition that she'd discovered more than he'd expected. They stood there in her grandfather's study, surrounded by the evidence of corruption and conspiracy, both understanding that their relationship had been built on lies they hadn't chosen to tell. The question now was whether they could find a way forward together, or whether the forces arrayed against them were too powerful to overcome. Outside, the Maine winter wind howled around the old house, and somewhere in Washington, Vivian Meridian was undoubtedly planning her next move in a game where the stakes were higher than either Serafina or Darius had ever imagined. The secure satellite phone in Vivian Meridian's Georgetown townhouse buzzed at 3:17 a.m., jolting her from sleep. Her contact's voice was tense with urgency. "She's found them. The Ravencrest girl has the recordings." Vivian sat up in bed, instantly alert. She'd spent decades building her network of compromised officials and foreign intelligence contacts, carefully constructing a web of influence that stretched across multiple continents. The thought that some dead senator's granddaughter could unravel everything with a collection of old cassette tapes was both infuriating and terrifying. How do you know? Our surveillance picked up unusual activity at the main property. Thornfield arrived with a full security detail and stayed for 6 hours. When they left, the girl was carrying a bag she didn't have when she arrived. Vivian's mind raced through the implications. If Serafina had discovered Zachariah's evidence, she now possessed enough information to destroy not only Vivian's career, but her entire operation. Worse, she could expose the network of foreign agents who'd been paying millions for American intelligence over the past decade. Where are they now? Private Jet filed a flight plan to Colorado Springs. Thornfield's using a safe house in Shadowmere Valley. Seems he's keeping her isolated while they figure out their next move. Colorado made sense. The remote mountain location would provide security while Darius decided how to handle the information Serafina had uncovered. What he didn't realize was that his efforts to protect her had just made Vivian's job easier. Isolated locations worked both ways. Activate the Denver assets. I want this handled quietly and permanently. And the president? Vivian considered her options. Darius's death would create complications she wasn't prepared to handle yet, but his continued interference in her plans was becoming untenable. Make it look like a terrorist attack. Mountain cabin, tragic accident during a private getaway. The grieving Secretary of State will have to step up to provide stability during the national crisis. 2 days later, Serafina stood at the window of the secluded cabin in Shadowmere Valley, watching snow fall across the Rocky Mountain landscape. The past 48 hours had transformed her understanding of everything she thought she knew about her marriage and her husband. Darius had spent those days carefully explaining his undercover work with the DEA and CIA, revealing a 3-year operation to infiltrate Mexican cartels that had been corrupting American politicians for over a decade. His apparent moral compromises, the suspicious business deals, the questionable appointments, the ethical lapses that had damaged his presidency, were all carefully constructed elements of a cover identity designed to make him attractive to criminal organizations. My reputation was the price I paid to get close enough to gather evidence, he'd explained while they sat by the cabin's fireplace. Every scandal that hurt my administration was actually progress in building the kind of criminal credibility that cartels trust. The revelation recontextualized everything about their relationship. His emotional distance hadn't been rejection. It had been the trained response of someone who couldn't afford to let personal feelings compromise a mission that had already cost several agents their lives. Why didn't you tell me? Serafina had asked. Because the fewer people who knew, the safer everyone would be. And because I didn't expect to develop genuine feelings for you. That confession had broken down the walls between them more effectively than any declaration of love. They'd spent the previous night talking until dawn, sharing truths they'd both been too frightened to voice before. For the first time since their wedding, Serafina felt like she was seeing the real Darius Thornfield, not the politician or the operative, but the man who'd been carrying the weight of his country's security on his shoulders for years. The sound of approaching vehicles interrupted her thoughts. Through the snow, she could see black SUVs winding up the mountain road toward their cabin. Her pulse quickened with relief. Darius had gone to Colorado Springs for a secure video conference with his CIA handlers, and she'd been expecting his return. But as the vehicles drew closer, something felt wrong. The approaching convoy was too large, and the lead vehicle bore none of the presidential markings she'd grown accustomed to seeing. Serafina's training as a senator's daughter kicked in. She'd grown up around security protocols and knew enough to recognize when something was off. These weren't Secret Service vehicles. She grabbed the satellite phone Darius had left for emergencies and dialed his number while moving toward the back of the cabin. The call went straight to voicemail, which meant he was still in his classified briefing. The first gunshot shattered the front window. Serafina dropped to the floor as bullets erupted through the cabin's walls. Her grandfather's recordings were still in her bag, along with the additional evidence she and Darius had compiled over the past 2 days. If these men were here to silence her, they were also here to destroy the proof of Vivian's decades-long conspiracy. She crawled toward the back door, staying low as the attackers surrounded the building. The cabin had been chosen for its isolation, which now worked against her. The nearest neighbor was 20 miles away, and Darius wouldn't return for at least 3 hours. The back door exploded inward as armed men in tactical gear breached the cabin. Serafina bolted through the rear window, clutching her bag as she plunged into the snowy forest behind the property. The Rocky Mountain wilderness in winter was a hostile environment for someone without proper equipment, but it was better than facing professional killers with military training. Serafina's childhood summers at Ironcliff Point had included enough outdoor activities to give her basic survival skills, though she'd never imagined using them while running for her life through a Colorado blizzard. Behind her, she could hear the men coordinating their search. They moved with military precision, using radio communication and tactical formations that suggested extensive training. These weren't common criminals. They were professionals, the kind of operators that governments used for jobs they couldn't officially acknowledge. Serafina pushed deeper into the forest, her breath forming clouds in the freezing air. She needed to reach the emergency communications equipment Darius had shown her at the ranger station 5 miles down the mountain. If she could get a message to his security team, she might survive long enough for rescue. The sound of approaching helicopters made her heart race with hope until she realized they weren't coming to save her. The aircraft bore no government markings, and their search patterns suggested they were working with the ground team trying to hunt her down. 2 hours into her desperate flight through the mountains, hypothermia was becoming as dangerous as the men pursuing her. Her fingers were numb despite her gloves, and her legs felt heavy from pushing through knee-deep snow. The bag containing her grandfather's evidence seemed to weigh more with each step, but she couldn't abandon the only proof of Vivian's crimes. That's when she heard the distinctive sound of military helicopters approaching from the south, different aircraft from the ones hunting her. Through the swirling snow, she could see government markings and the familiar escort pattern of a presidential security detail. Darius had ended his briefing early. The rescue helicopters engaged the attackers in a firefight that echoed across the mountain valley. Serafina used the distraction to push toward an open clearing where she could signal for pickup. Her legs gave out as she reached the meadow, exhaustion and cold finally overwhelming her determination. The presidential helicopter touched down 50 yards away, and Darius leaped out before the aircraft had fully landed. He ran toward her through the snow, his face a mask of fury and terror that she'd never seen before. "I'm sorry," she gasped as he reached her. "I couldn't let them get the recordings." Instead of answering, Darius pulled her against him with desperate intensity. "I thought I'd lost you." The confession hit her harder than the mountain cold. This wasn't the calculated concern of a politician protecting an asset. This was raw emotion from a man who'd just faced the possibility of losing someone he cared about more than his mission or his career. The men who attacked the cabin, Serafina managed through chattering teeth. They weren't random terrorists. Someone sent them specifically for the evidence. "I know." Darius helped her toward the helicopter, his arms supporting her weight. "Vivian disappeared from Washington 6 hours ago. Her security detail claims she's attending a classified briefing, but there's no record of any such meeting." As they reached the aircraft, Darius turned to face her with an intensity that made her heart race despite her exhaustion. Snow clung to his dark hair, and his eyes reflected both relief and something deeper, a vulnerability he'd never allowed her to see before. "I need you to know something," he said, his voice barely audible over the helicopter rotors. "When I got the call that you were under attack, I realized that protecting this country means nothing if I lose the person I love in the process." The word hung between them like a bridge across the chasm that had separated them since their wedding day. Love, not duty, not political convenience, not strategic advantage. Love. "I love you too," Serafina replied, the admission feeling both terrifying and liberating. "I've been trying not to for weeks, but I can't help it." Darius kissed her then, fierce and desperate, and completely unlike the careful touches they'd shared before. This was a man claiming the woman he loved, politics and protocol be damned. As they broke apart, both breathing heavily, Serafina realized that everything had changed again. They weren't just partners in survival anymore. They were allies in love, facing an enemy who had underestimated the power of genuine emotion in a world built on calculated manipulation. The helicopter lifted off, carrying them away from Shadowmere Valley and toward a confrontation with Vivian Meridian that would determine not only their survival, but the future of American democracy itself. But for this moment, surrounded by the chaos of their circumstances, Darius and Serafina had found something real and unbreakable, a love strong enough to survive conspiracy, betrayal, and the brutal realities of Washington power games. The hunt was far from over, but now they were hunting together. The secure FBI facility in Quantico buzzed with activity as Agent Caleb Stormwind spread classified documents across the conference table. At 38, Stormwind had built his reputation by taking down corruption networks that other agents couldn't touch, but even he seemed overwhelmed by the scope of what Serafina's grandfather had uncovered. Zachariah Ravencrest was more thorough than we realized, Stormwind said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he studied the evidence. These recordings document nearly 2 decades of systematic corruption orchestrated by Secretary Meridian. Bank transfers, meeting locations, compromised officials. It's a complete roadmap of how she built her network. Darius sat beside Serafina, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. The past 24 hours had transformed their relationship from political arrangement to genuine partnership. The attack in Colorado had stripped away their remaining pretenses, forcing them to confront feelings they'd both been trying to suppress. The foreign intelligence component is what makes this treason rather than simple corruption, Stormwind continued. We've identified payments from Chinese, Russian, and Iranian intelligence services totaling over $40 million across the past decade. Vivian wasn't just selling information. She was actively recruiting American officials to work against their own country's interests. Serafina studied the photographs scattered across the table. Images of Vivian at diplomatic functions, meeting with foreign officials, attending classified briefings she should never have accessed. Her grandfather had been building this case for years, methodically documenting evidence that painted an undeniable picture of betrayal at the highest levels of government. My father, Serafina said quietly. How long has she been manipulating him? Stormwind pulled out a thick folder marked with Thaddeus Ravencrest's name. Based on financial records and communication intercepts, we believe she first approached him 8 years ago. He'd accumulated significant gambling debts during his divorce proceedings. Debts that made him vulnerable to exactly the kind of assistance Vivian specialized in providing. The timeline made 6 sense to Serafina. 8 years ago, her parents' marriage had been falling apart, her father had been drinking heavily, and his judgment had become increasingly erratic. Vivian had identified his weaknesses and exploited them with surgical precision. She didn't just offer him money, Stormwind explained. She provided a complete support system, financial assistance, legal protection, political backing for his re-election campaigns. In exchange, he gave her access to Senate Intelligence Committee materials and advance notice of investigative activities that might threaten her network. Darius leaned forward, his presidential training taking over as he processed the strategic implications. How many others are compromised? We've identified at least 17 current members of Congress, 6 federal judges, and multiple State Department officials. Vivian's network extends into defense contractors, intelligence agencies, and international banking institutions. She's essentially built a shadow government that operates parallel to legitimate American institutions. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Serafina realized that her forced marriage hadn't been a simple political arrangement. It had been part of a larger plan to position Vivian for ultimate power. By compromising Darius's presidency through scandal and personal complications, she'd been preparing to step into the vacuum that would follow his political destruction. There's something else, Stormwind said, pulling out a series of intercepted communications. We believe Vivian is planning to eliminate both of you before this evidence can be presented to Congress. Our intelligence suggests she's already mobilized assets for what she's calling a definitive solution to the Thornfield problem. The words sent ice through Serafina's veins. The attack in Colorado hadn't been a desperate attempt to silence her. It had been the opening move in Vivian's endgame. She can't simply have the president assassinated, Serafina protested. The security protocols alone would make that impossible. Unless she has help from inside the system, Darius said grimly. If her network includes Secret Service personnel or other security officials, my protection details could be compromised. Stormwind nodded gravely. We're operating under the assumption that Vivian has assets embedded throughout the government. That's why we're conducting this investigation through a compartmentalized team that reports directly to the FBI director. Even within our own agency, we can't be certain who might be working for her. The paranoia was well-founded but exhausting. Serafina understood now why Darius had seemed so isolated and suspicious when she'd first met him. In a world where anyone could be compromised, trust became a luxury that could get you killed. "What's our next move?" Darius asked. "We need Vivian to reveal herself," Stormwind replied. "As long as she maintains her cover as the loyal Secretary of State, we can't move against her without triggering a constitutional crisis. We need evidence of her actively working against American interests, something undeniable that will justify her arrest." Serafina studied the agent's expression, recognizing the calculation behind his words. "You want to use us as bait." The plan involves setting up a scenario where Vivian believes she can eliminate both of you while seizing control of the evidence. We'll create the appearance that you're planning to go public with the recordings, forcing her to act decisively. Darius's hand tightened on Serafina's shoulder. "Absolutely not. I won't put my wife in that kind of danger." The possessive way he said, "my wife," sent warmth through Serafina despite the gravity of their situation. For the first time since their wedding, he was claiming their relationship publicly, choosing her safety over political strategy. "It's the only way to stop her," Serafina said quietly. "If we don't end this now, she'll keep coming after us until she succeeds. And how many other people will she destroy while we're hiding?" The next 6 hours were spent planning an operation that would either expose Vivian's conspiracy or get them both killed. The plan was elegantly simple. They would announce a press conference at the National Observatory where Darius would reveal evidence of foreign infiltration within his administration. The location's symbolic significance, a place dedicated to observing distant truths, would make it irresistible to Vivian's ego. What they wouldn't announce was that the press conference was a trap, designed to force Vivian into making a move that would reveal her true loyalties. As they prepared to leave Quantico, Stormwind pulled Serafina aside. "There's one more thing you should know. Your father wants to see you." Thaddeus Ravencrest sat in the federal holding facility like a broken man. The distinguished senator who had once commanded respect and authority now appeared small and defeated, his silver hair unkempt and his eyes hollow with shame. "Serafina." His voice cracked as she entered the visiting room. "I never wanted any of this to touch you. But it did touch me, Daddy. Your choices destroyed my life and forced me into a marriage I never wanted." "I know." Thaddeus reached across the table, his hands shaking. "But I also know that marriage became something real. I can see it in your eyes. You love him." The observation surprised her with its accuracy. Despite everything that had brought them together, despite the manipulation and conspiracy that had orchestrated their union, she did love Darius Thornfield. More than that, she was finally confident that he loved her in return. "Vivian approached me 8 years ago when I was at my lowest point," Thaddeus continued. "She offered solutions to problems that seemed impossible to solve. I told myself I was protecting our family, but really I was just protecting myself." "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because Agent Stormwind says you're planning to confront her directly. Vivian is more dangerous than you realize, sweetheart. She doesn't just manipulate people, she destroys them completely when they're no longer useful." Thaddeus pulled out a handwritten letter. "This is my full confession detailing every crime Vivian asked me to commit, every piece of classified information I provided, every vote I cast based on her instructions. I'm giving it to the FBI in exchange for their promise to protect you during whatever comes next." Serafina took the letter, feeling the weight of her father's redemption in her hands. "It's too late for us to go back to the way things were. I know, but maybe it's not too late for you to have the life you deserve with the man you love." As Serafina left the federal facility, she understood that her father's confession represented more than just evidence against Vivian. It was his attempt to finally choose his daughter's welfare over his own survival. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not only their personal survival, but the future of American democracy itself. Vivian Meridian had spent decades building a network of corruption and foreign influence that threatened the very foundations of the Republic. Tomorrow night at the National Observatory, under the stars that had witnessed the birth of the nation, they would discover whether love and truth were stronger than conspiracy and betrayal. The price of truth had never been higher, but Serafina and Darius were finally ready to pay it together. The National Observatory stood against the Washington night sky like a beacon of scientific truth in a city built on political deception. Serafina adjusted the wireless microphone hidden beneath her navy blue dress, feeling the reassuring weight of the recording device that would capture whatever Vivian said during their final confrontation. Audio check complete. Agent Stormwind's voice crackled through her nearly invisible earpiece. We have teams positioned throughout the facility. Remember, we need her to incriminate herself clearly before we can move. Darius stood beside her in the observatory's main dome, his hand briefly touching hers in a gesture of support that looked casual to outside observers but conveyed volumes about how much their relationship had evolved. They'd arrived separately to maintain the illusion that their marriage remained strained by her father's scandal. She'll come, Darius said quietly. Vivian can't resist an opportunity to gloat, especially when she thinks she holds all the cards. The press conference was scheduled to begin in 30 minutes, with major networks prepared to broadcast Darius's announcement about foreign infiltration within his administration. What the media didn't know was that the real story would unfold before the cameras ever started rolling. Footsteps echoed through the observatory's marble corridors, followed by the distinctive click of expensive heels that Serafina had learned to associate with power and danger. Vivian Meridian entered the dome wearing a perfectly tailored black suit that made her look like she was attending a funeral, which, Serafina realized, she probably was. Mr. President, Vivian said with false warmth. I came as soon as I heard about this impromptu press conference. Surely you don't intend to make major policy announcements without consulting your Secretary of State. The consultation period ended when you tried to have my wife murdered in Colorado, Darius replied with cold precision. Vivian's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the calculating predator beneath her diplomatic facade. I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about. I've been in classified briefings for the past 3 days. Briefings that don't exist in any official government records, Serafina said, stepping forward. Just like the bank accounts you've been using to receive payments from foreign intelligence services. Careful, dear. Grief over your father's arrest seems to have affected your judgment. Vivian's tone carried a subtle threat. Wild accusations against senior government officials could be seen as evidence of mental instability. The implied threat was clear. Vivian still believed she could destroy Serafina's credibility and isolate Darius from the only person who could expose her network. What she didn't realize was that they'd moved far beyond the political calculations that had defined their early relationship. Show her, Darius said quietly. Serafina pulled out a digital audio player and pressed play. Zachariah Ravencrest's voice filled the observatory dome, clear and authoritative despite the years that had passed since the recording was made. Vivian Meridian has been selling classified American intelligence to foreign governments for over a decade, using a network of compromised officials who are completely dependent on her protection. Vivian's composure cracked completely. The diplomatic smile vanished, replaced by naked fury that transformed her elegant features into something predatory and dangerous. You have no idea what you're interfering with, she snarled. The old man was a fool who never understood that American democracy is an illusion. Real power belongs to those intelligent enough to seize it from idealistic children who still believe in patriotic fairy tales. Keep talking, Serafina encouraged, knowing that Stormwind's team was recording every word. Tell us how you really feel about the country you swore to serve. Serve? Vivian laughed bitterly. I've spent 20 years watching mediocre men stumble through positions they were never qualified to hold while I did the actual work of governance. Your husband is just the latest in a long line of figureheads who mistake public approval for genuine authority. Darius remained perfectly still, his presidential training allowing him to absorb Vivian's vitriol without visible reaction. But Serafina could see the fury burning in his eyes at hearing his life's work dismissed so contemptuously. The beauty of my network, Vivian continued, is that it's designed to survive individual exposure. Even if you destroy me, the system I created will continue operating. Too many people depend on the protection I provide for them to risk returning to legitimate governance. Protection built on blackmail and foreign money, Serafina countered. Protection built on understanding human nature. Everyone has weaknesses, everyone has secrets, Everyone can be controlled if you possess the right leverage. Vivian moved closer, her voice dropping to an intimate whisper. Even you, dear Serafina. Do you think your precious husband would still love you if he knew about the abortion you had in college? The one your father paid to keep secret. The words hit Serafina like a physical blow. She'd never told anyone about that painful decision, made during a brief relationship with a fellow student who'd abandoned her the moment pregnancy became inconvenient. The secret had haunted her for years, representing everything she'd feared about her own worthiness for love and family. But instead of the shame and panic she'd expected to feel, Serafina found herself filled with something else entirely. A fierce protectiveness for the woman she'd been at 19, frightened and alone, and making the best decision she could with the information available to her. You're right, she said clearly. I did have an abortion in college. It was one of the most difficult decisions of my life, and I don't regret it. She turned to face Darius, whose expression remained steady and supportive despite learning something deeply personal about her past. I should have told you myself, but I was afraid you'd see me differently. The only thing I see, Darius replied quietly, is a woman who survived something difficult and became stronger because of it. Your past doesn't change how I feel about you. Vivian's face contorted with rage as her psychological weapon failed to detonate. Touching. Too bad neither of you will live long enough to build a future on such romantic delusions. The gun appeared in her hand with practiced efficiency, the same kind of compact weapon favored by intelligence operatives who needed concealable firepower. She'd positioned herself between them and the dome's main exit, cutting off their primary escape route. The tragic story will be that a deranged Secretary of State, driven mad by the stress of recent scandals, murdered the President and First Lady before taking her own life. The country will mourn, investigations will be launched, and my network will emerge stronger than ever under new leadership. Except for one problem, Serafina said, moving slightly to place herself between Vivian and Darius. We're not the only ones who know about your network. Red laser dots appeared on Vivian's chest as FBI sniper teams revealed their positions throughout the observatory. Agent Stormwind emerged from behind the main telescope, his weapon drawn and trained on the Secretary of State. Vivian Meridian, you're under arrest for treason, conspiracy, and attempted murder of federal officials. For a moment, Vivian seemed to consider fighting rather than surrendering. Her finger tightened on the trigger as she calculated her chances of killing at least one of them before the snipers could stop her. Don't, Darius said firmly. You've already lost. Don't make it worse. The fight went out of Vivian like air escaping from a punctured balloon. She lowered the weapon and allowed Stormwind's agents to take her into custody, her face a mask of defeated fury. As they led her away, she turned back to Serafina one final time. You think you've won something precious, but power in Washington is never really defeated. It just changes hands. Enjoy your happiness while it lasts. The threat would have terrified Serafina weeks earlier, but now it barely registered. She'd faced professional killers in the Colorado mountains and a loaded gun in the National Observatory. More importantly, she'd discovered that the love she shared with Darius was strong enough to survive revelations about both their pasts. 6 months later, Serafina stood in the gardens of Wisteria Estate in rural Virginia, watching workers put finishing touches on an outdoor ceremony space that bore no resemblance to the sterile political theater of their first wedding. Today's celebration would be intimate and genuine, a renewal of vows between two people who'd found real love in the most unlikely circumstances. The investigations triggered by Vivian's arrest had consumed Washington for months, ultimately exposing a corruption network that reached into 17 foreign countries and implicated dozens of American officials. Darius had testified before Congress with the dignity and integrity that had made Serafina fall in love with him, even as he announced his decision not to seek re-election. The presidency was never supposed to be a lifetime appointment, he told the nation in his final address from the Oval Office. I've served my country to the best of my ability, but now I want to serve it in a different way, by building institutions that protect the most vulnerable members of our society. The Thornfield Foundation focused on combating human trafficking and supporting survivors of exploitation, work that felt more meaningful to both of them than the political calculations that had dominated their early relationship. Serafina had thrown herself into the foundation's operations, using her experience as a senator's daughter to navigate the complex networks of government agencies and international organizations. "You're glowing," Darius said, joining her beneath the wisteria arbor where they would exchange their new vows. At 6 months pregnant with twins, Serafina felt more beautiful and confident than she ever had as a young woman in Washington society. "I'm happy," she replied simply. "For the first time in my adult life, I'm exactly where I want to be with exactly the person I want to be with." Darius kissed her gently, his hands resting on her growing belly where their children were developing. Children who would grow up knowing they were conceived in love rather than political necessity. No regrets about leaving the White House. Serafina looked around at the gardens they'd designed together, filled with friends and family who were there to celebrate love rather than witness a political transaction. Her father sat in the front row, still marked by his experiences in federal prison, but gradually rebuilding his relationship with his daughter through honest conversation and genuine remorse. "The only thing I regret," she said, "is that it took us so long to figure out that we were meant to be together." As the sun set over the Virginia countryside, Darius and Serafina Thornfield renewed their vows beneath an arch of purple flowers, promising to choose each other every day regardless of whatever challenges the future might bring. They'd learned that sometimes the most beautiful love stories began with impossible circumstances and impossible people who discovered they were perfect for each other. Their first marriage had been a political arrangement designed to save 2 families from destruction. Their second marriage was a celebration of everything they'd built together: love, trust, partnership, and hope for a future that belonged entirely to them. Sometimes fate pushed people toward destinations their hearts had always known they belonged, even when the journey seemed impossible to survive. In the gardens of Wisteria Estate, surrounded by the people who mattered most, Serafina and Darius finally came home to each other.